Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Vital Descent. I am your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode number 281, and the show notes may be found at vitaldescent.com/281. And in this episode, we're going to be discussing Cormac McCarthy's probably best work, his most renowned work, which is Blood Meridian. It's a novel that's kind of entered the public consciousness a little bit more in the last couple of years because of it's kind of been labeled like bro literature. And I think it's kind of interesting how it arrived at that point in time. So we're going to unpack that. We're going to unpack the book, and we're going to, in the last half, focus on a specific passage from that book that I think has relevance for this show. This will be a review with spoilers. So if you have not read Blood Meridian, I'm going to spoil the book. Just fair warning there. Even though I had the book spoiled to me before I read it, I still really enjoyed reading it. Not without little caveats here and there, which we're also going to be discussing here. And also just to, towards the end, kind of discuss the direction where the show is going. I think, I don't know, long story short, I think I'm just going to start doing shows about whatever I feel like talking about instead of specific topics. And maybe you'll find them interesting, but I've been doing a lot of reading lately. I do have a major project I'm working on for Vital Descent, which is one of the reasons why I haven't been putting a lot of content out lately, is because I've been working on that. But it has to do with fiction. And so we're going to be maybe doing a bit more of that until that project is like finished enough to be announced. So Blood Meridian, I don't want to bury the lead too much here. Blood Meridian is one of the books that I've been on a big reading kick the last few months, and fiction, and one of the books that I enjoyed the most, but was kind of the most challenging. And at this point in time, let's just hop on over to one of the main reasons why I think this book has had a resurgence in the last couple of years here, at least, well, maybe a year ago, is Wendigoon, one of the most popular, like a huge 4.15 million subscriber YouTube channel. He's a big nerd like I am, and I recognize a lot of myself in him. So I think he's a little bit younger than me, and obviously wildly more popular as a content creator, and for good reason. But he does all sorts of topics of things that just interest him because they're interesting. And one of the things he does is book reviews from time to time. I don't know if he's an English major like I am or what, but he decided to review Blood Meridian, and I kind of came across it, and I was like, oh yeah, I heard about Blood Meridian like 15 years ago when I was in high school or something like that. And I heard that it was a violent book and that it was one of the most violent books ever written. And I just never got around to reading it. And so I picked up a copy. Here's my copy, Blood Meridian. I started watching some of his video. It's 5 hours long, but it has 8.8 million views. And I'm like, I mean, imagine he talks about in the beginning of his video how he feels like he has this weight of responsibility to the work because it's one of the, like, critically considered to be one of the greatest American novel, like the quintessential American novel, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. But he says he owes this sense of responsibility to it. And I think that's true, because if you get 8.8 million people to watch a 5 hour long video, or at least parts of it, about the great American novel, you're going to have, I mean, he might be single-handedly responsible for creating a renaissance around this book, like a popular renaissance around that book. And I think just that thing, like that idea alone, is fascinating by itself. So I'm not going to do 5 hours worth of coverage or justice on this book, but really to tear apart the one speech by the judge, which is the main antagonist at the end, and talk about that. So before, what is the book, right? The book is it's a Western. It's about, I think it's the interwar period between the end of the Spanish-American War and the beginning of the Civil War. So it takes place in like the 1850s. And at that period of time, there was this period of like sporadic non-state and also state-sponsored violence in around the border regions between the United States and Mexico. And I think it mostly took place like west of Texas, even around that border area. So you basically had the American government, the natives, all these different native tribes, and you had, it was like a triumvirate of powers, of conflicting powers. The US settlers, the natives, and all of their associated, different tribes, and the Mexicans and the Mexican government. And at the time, there were these people, I don't know exactly what they were called, but they were these people who were like privateers who were sponsored by local governments to go out and hunt natives. And one, this all takes place in this milieu, this historical milieu. And one of the groups, historically, because it's like a historical fiction novel, was called the Glanton Gang, and they were one of the most violent of these groups, these headhunters, these scalp hunters that would go around and were contracted by various governments, the US and Mexico mostly, to go out and scalp Indians and bring them back for their scalps. And in this whole thing, the main character is named the Kid, and you never know what his real name is because he's just known as the Kid. And as a premise, if you've never read Cormac McCarthy before, he doesn't use punctuation, which I think it's intentional on his part because he wants you to pay more attention to who's saying what in the dialogue. And it does force you to use context clues and to pay closer attention to the text at large just to figure out who's saying what. But he is very good at characterization, and so it makes it so that you really get to know the characters enough to be able to infer who is speaking without, tags like he said or the kid said, or sometimes he includes that, but the judge says. So essentially, like, I'm not going to recap the whole novel, but in the beginning, it starts with the kid, and he's like 14 years old, and he grows up in like Tennessee, and his mother is dead, and his father is a school teacher, but he's also a drunk. And he's very violent and beats the crap out of the kid and never teaches the kid how to read or do anything like that. So one day the kid decides to leave. So he leaves Tennessee and basically makes his way out west. He goes, I think, first to like Louisiana and has these experiences. And then he goes further and further west and basically gets up in these violent acts. So he runs into this guy named Toadvine, and they get into a fight because they were walking on like a board. I forget what you call like in World War I, they had these boards, or in the Old West, these boards you would walk on so you wouldn't have to step in the mud. They wouldn't move, and so they bump into each other, and it starts a fight where they basically beat the hell out of each other, and he wakes up the next day because he has been knocked out, and he decides to make up with this guy. So they go to a hotel, and they basically burn the hotel down to get back at this guy's enemy or something. And that's kind of an introduction to the world that the kid, he's young, he's 14 years old, he already has a penchant for like extreme violence. It reminds me a lot of Clockwork Orange in a way, where you have Alex, the main character, who is this violent hoodlum. And so the kid has these various misadventures. He runs into the judge, who's a character he's going to run into later. And it's at this big tent revival where the kid shows up, and there's a preacher just going on for days and days. And the judge walks into this tent full of people and like gets up on stage and accuses the priest who's giving this days long revival, accuses the priest of having sex with the goat and being wanted and being on the run for molesting young girls. And all hell breaks loose in the tent, and people are fighting and dying, and the kid cuts his way out of the tent, and because they want to get after this revivalist preacher. And later on, the kid goes into the saloon, and the judge is there, and someone asks him how he knew all that stuff about the preacher. And he says, oh, the preacher, I don't know, I've never seen him before, I've never heard of him before, I just made all that up. And everyone's like starts laughing. But that's a great introduction to who the judge is. He's this like immensely tall albino character who is completely hairless, walking around the Old West. And it really is he's like an alien put there, like some kind of, and you, throughout the book, it's kind of hinted at, and that basically that the judge is immortal, that he's some immortal being, kind of like a phantom, or, but he's a real person, like flesh and blood, but that he has all this knowledge from all these travels across the world of things that a mortal man probably wouldn't have. And I'm really getting ahead of myself because this is like a late book kind of reveal, or like it's something that's implied that you put together. But essentially, what he is, I think he's the embodiment of evil, of the evil of like North America, or like or like the evil of man's inherent nature, something like that, like the id, pure id. And so the kid still is going on these misadventures. He gets into one vigilante group that ends up getting massacred, and he's escapes barely, massacred by Indians. He escapes barely and makes it to this town, where then he's recruited by the Glanton gang, because once he makes it to the town after the first like vigilante group he was in was massacred, um, he wants a drink from the Mexican barman who he offers to sweep the floor for. So there's like lost in translation, and he sweeps the floor, but the Mexican bartender's like, I'm not paying you, like, screw off. So the kid gets mad, goes behind the bar, takes two drinks, like two bottles, breaks one, and like basically gouges the eyes out of the bartender, and then drinks the other one and just gets completely just sloshed, and then is picked up by this Glanton gang, who's led by I forget the main character. It's been a couple weeks since I've read it. John Glanton, basically the leader of this gang, and the judge is like his right hand man. He's like the deputy, like the main deputy, second in command. So they go off on all these adventures, and throughout the book, it really, in a way, because I would call Cormac McCarthy's prose in this book to be masterful, but also very convoluted. And at times it can be a slog to work through his prose. And when I say prose, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, prose is like when a writer describes scenery, like descriptions, I guess you could say. But the way that McCarthy does it is very artful. It's very convoluted and artful and very high. And when you read it, you're like, wow, this guy. I mean, the book came out in 1985, I think, but it reads like a John Steinbeck novel, or like a Hemingway. Like if anyone else were to try it, you would think that they were a pompous asshole waxing poetically about, whatever they, like someone trying to write classical literature, something like that. And I don't think that McCarthy is trying to do it. I think he is doing it because he's critically renowned, known to be one of America's greatest novelists of all time, critically, by, at least someone who, like, if you think of Hemingway, I think that McCarthy would be like a generation after that, or like I forget the one who he wrote like A Rose for Emily. I should be able to, but it not Steinbeck, the other one. But at any rate, or As I Lay Dying, those ones. So the kid goes through the Glanton gang and has all these various misadventures that are just completely debauched, full of brutality, where they ride upon these like they hunt down these Indian settlements, and they just completely butcher and massacre women and children alike. There's like taking children and using them like infants, and using them as like clubs. And I'm trying to avoid strikes on YouTube because I don't know, it won't be monetized probably anyways, no matter what I do. And the middle of the book really is kind of a slog, because throughout the whole thing you're following these characters, and in the middle it's kind of lost that the kid is the main character. He kind of comes like he's not talked about all the time. It mostly is about kind of the gang and what they're doing. But they chase people down and they get in fights, and then they, finally get a whole bunch of scalps, and then they go to this the Mexican village to turn the scalps in, and they get all this, they're celebrated as heroes by the Mexican populace and throwing all these parties, and all the vendors are lining up to gift them these expensive watches and suits. And they throw this weeks long debauched party where they just are drinking and shooting their guns off and killing people in the Mexican town, and finally they get run out of town. And all of it just seems like basically debauchery for the sake of debauchery. Like, and at some point you're kind of wondering, like, well, what's McCarthy's point here? Like, this, there is a character arc, but you don't really know it until it's towards the last half of the book. And then going into the book, I kind of knew that the judge was like the main villain, but you're waiting for that to happen because he's not, I mean, he is an antagonist throughout the book, but he isn't really interacting with the kid at all. And he's just a member of the gang. And so you're not like, well, I mean, the gang themselves seem to be made up of antagonists. Even the kid seems like to be an anti-hero. But he does have a character arc towards the end. But I don't think the judge really does, aside from him just being this ever-present force, and then it's who he's like up against. So all this debauchery just goes on and continues these terrible things, and things are starting to get a little bit, as it goes on, more lean. And they go through periods where they are running out of food, or they're being pursued and they lose some guys, or things turn against them, and they come across eventually to this river crossing where this dentist or this doctor has left the east, and he came out west, and essentially all he did was set up a ferry across the river where there's no other crossings, and he's charging exorbitant prices for settlers to be ferried across the river. And the Glanton gang runs into like these Indians who are threatening the river crossing, and the Glanton gang decides to double cross the Indians because the Indians want this barrel of whiskey from a nearby town. And so they say, well, we'll get you the whiskey, and we want you to help us. Basically, I think this is what happens. We're going to get you a barrel of whiskey, and we want you in return to help us take this river crossing from this doctor. And they get the barrel of whiskey, and they end up drinking all of it. And then they trick the Indians by filling it with water and putting a little barrel of whiskey, like a tiny sack of whiskey, inside the barrel of water, that the whiskey in the little bag is connected to the spigot, so that the natives wouldn't, like, the Indians wouldn't know that it was full of water because until they were long gone, basically. And somehow they end up double crossing these Indians and like leaving them out to dry, and get killed in this job that they were doing. And then the Glanton gang takes over this river crossing, and they're just like charging exorbitant prices, getting debauched, and they go on this weeks long bender. And spoilers, during the weeks long bender, after they've gone through all this stuff, had all this crazy success, now they're sitting on like treasure chests full of gold and money. The Indians they double cross sneak up on them in the middle of the night during one of these drunk fests and just basically slaughter all of them except for the judge and the kid and maybe one or two other characters. And at that point in time, the judge turns on the kid and is like, he's just trying to survive at that point because the gang is gone, and the judge turns on the kid and wants to collect, because he's out of weapons and stuff, but wants to collect the weapon from the kid. And the kid resists, and they get into this like cat and mouse game fight, and then the kid just gets away. And then the kid goes on and lives for 30 years. And big spoilers here. The kid goes on and lives for 30 years, has this character arc where he kind of turns into a good guy, where he realizes that throughout the beginning of the book that he was, because at the beginning he was like 15 years old. All of his time with the Glanton gang until they were massacred happened before he was 15 years old. And then he goes and lives his life as like this Western guy, like a, a hired hand cowboy for 30 years. And when he's like 45 years old, he goes to this bar and just ran this tavern and just randomly runs into the judge again. And they sit down and they have this conversation at the bar where basically the kid, who's now, 47-year-old man, and the judge has not changed a day. He hasn't aged a day. He's like Bilbo Baggins or something, or Gollum with the ring, and that's not exact comparison. But they have this confrontation when they're sitting at the bar where the kid basically calls him out, and nothing happens. The judge keeps partying that night, and the kid goes up and I think he sleeps with like a whore or something. But in the middle of the night, the kid goes out to use the outhouse, and presumably the judge is there waiting for him. The scene is not described, but presumably the judge is waiting there for him and just completely butchers him, like tears him apart, completely apart, like complete mutilation, like an evisceration inside this outhouse, and then goes back into the inn and the bar and dances and dances and dances the night away. And then that's how the book ends. And that was spoiled to me when I was reading the introduction to the book, because apparently they discussed the ending in the introductions, and you shouldn't read the introduction, I guess. I usually don't read the introduction, but I thought that it would help me, like, curse you, Harold Bloom. I know he's a famous critic, but he wrote the introduction, and I wanted to be kind of primed for seeing, because I know this is a difficult book, because I'd started reading it before and I didn't really get that far, but I wanted to be primed to look out for any themes or anything that I should have in mind as I'm reading the book. And you would think the introduction would be a great place to do that without spoiling the book. Be like, oh, well, keep an eye out for this here, or these passages there, or something like that. But I thought it was fitting. It does slog in the middle a little bit, and I thought that was on purpose, because I thought that the drudgery, in a sense, of everything they're doing and the weight of what they're doing and the seeming pointlessness of it was supposed to be part of the description of really getting you to know the countryside and the spirit of that area and the time. And even though McCarthy's prose is masterful, it gets really boring. And it's incredible when you're reading it. Like, of course, he uses a lot of like similes, I think they're called, when you use like or as, like a bird across the sky, or there was a certain part where he was like describing the sunset as like being a phallus or something like that. There was a lot of it, though. There was a whole lot, and I thought that maybe it was fitting and on purpose and added to the masterful, like, telling of the book, because the description was as bland as the suns. Like, you can only describe twilight and sunset across the desert scene with mountains so many times. It just seemed like every scene description was the same, and there are long passages where all they're doing is just, well, they rode from here to there, and the sky was, azure with like a robin's egg with, speckled clouds, and the spirit of the old, of the West was drilled into their bones with every like plodding of the horse's hoof or every gallop or something. Just on and on and on, descriptions like that for so long of a time. And then periods of intermittent violence where things are ultra brutal and it just comes on like crazy. Or, they're sitting down at the campfire and the judge decides that he's going to shoot someone in the back of the head or something like that. And the judge himself, you don't really learn anything about his character until like 3/4 of the way through the book before they get, killed because of their own hubris. And before all of that, he really is started to be described like his backstory. And he's described as having all of these worldly experiences and knowing things about everywhere across the world and he's very articulate, and he goes on these incredibly long not soliloquies, but like monologues. I think it's a monologue where he's just giving a speech. And you got to know that, like, well, okay, there was this one passage that I'm going to pick through for you where I'm like, okay, that's the theme of the book. And it came after like so much of just seemingly nothing happening except violence for the sake of violence. And at some point, I mean, it felt like a really long book to read. And I think I read it in like a week and a half, but it felt longer than that. It's 350 pages in my version. And the text is not super small, but it's not large text either. But it was hard to get through. I'll say that. Like, it was entertaining at times, but at other times it was just like, this sucks. Like, I don't want to keep reading this. I know it just seems pointless, and there's just so much of the same kind of descriptions, and it doesn't seem like there's much that's important happening. Like, yeah, they're going through and doing all this stuff and getting in trouble, but sometimes it amazes me how, because if you go through and try and write something yourself and you look at on YouTube at all these, like, there's all these YouTubers out there who are editors or former editors who are like, here's 5 tricks for you to get better at writing this and this and that, or like steps to writing your first novel. And all of it is like, well, you have to have an interesting main character. That's where it all starts. And you need to know that character and know things about that character. And the character has to change throughout the book, and there has to be a very solidly defined like resistance to that change or obstacles to overcome, where this happens because that happened, and then because that happened they have this problem now, and all these steps are leading towards some kind of character arc or like destination where the character changes, and all that's resolved, or they get from point A to point B. And it just didn't really seem to me like the kid had any kind of character motivation. There was no, like, he was just kind of aimlessly swept up in this thing, and in a way he was kind of a convenient witness to be telling what the real story was, which I thought was the story of the Glanton gang, and John Glanton and Judge Holden going through and doing these things. But it just never seemed like anyone had any kind of definite place they were going or motivation why to get there, or knowing how to get there, or finding out how to get there, aside from just like, I'm here in this moment, I guess, trying to survive. Like, maybe the struggle is the kid trying to like grow up or just experience this experience of leaving Tennessee and staying alive long enough and figuring out what he wants to do. And I guess in a sense he kind of gets there because, and I guess I'm realizing this just talking aloud like I sometimes do on this show, but maybe it is just him trying to navigate the world as a young person, trying to cut out a place for him in this existence where he grew up without a mother who died giving birth to him, and then had a terrible father who was a drunk, and running away from home and trying to find something better, but only finding death and destruction, and partly due to his own actions. I mean, he's not an innocent person here. And yeah, it wasn't until this speech happened where things, I thought, started to really come together in the book. And I'll just it's on page 259, and here's a passage, part of the passage here, where I really thought this was so important, because I almost wanted to stop reading the book, because I'm like, well, there it is. That's the message that we're looking for, and they're can't really be much of anything else because there hasn't been much of anything to this point. So you'll see why it's relevant to this show. Okay, so they're basically sitting around the fire talking, and the judge starts talking. The mountains to the north lay sunwise in corrugated folds, and the days were cool and the nights were cold, and they sat about the fire each in his round of darkness, in that round of dark, while the idiot watched from his cage at the edge of the light. There's a lot of stuff that happened, misadventures, that ended up with like this idiot person in a cage joining their caravan, with his brother who carts him around as a circus spectacle, I think. The judge cracked with the back of an axe the shin bone on an antelope, and the hot marrow dripped smoking on the stones. They watched him. The subject was war. So I think it's important that while they're sitting around talking about war, the judge has roasted the shin bone of an antelope, and he cracks it open and drips the marrow onto the stones. Maybe he should have drank it, but he didn't. I don't know. So he says the good book says that, or someone else says, the good book says that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword, said a black member of the group, the Glanton gang. The judge smiled, his face shining with grease. What right man would have it any other way, he said. The good book does indeed count war an evil, said Irving, yet there's many a blood tale of war inside of it. It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be, that way and not some other way. He turned to Brown, from whom he'd heard some whispered slur or demur. Ah, Davy, he said, it's your own trade we honor here. Why not rather take a small bow? Let each acknowledge each. So the judge is saying, you're fighting, but basically you're arguing against me about what I'm saying about war, but yet you're out here. It's your trade. You should know it. You should know the truth of it because it's your trade. That's what we're doing out here. We just butchered all these people. My trade? Certainly. What is my trade? War. War is your trade, is it not? And it ain't yours? Mine too, very much so, says the judge. What about all them notebooks and bones and stuff? And he's referring to the judge carries around this notebook, and he makes all these sketches of things like anatomy sketches, or just basically documenting what he comes across. All other trades are contained in that of war, says the judge. Is that why war endures? No, it endures because young men love it and old men love it in them. Those that fought, those that did not. That's your notion? The judge smiled. Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows, too, that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake because they inhere the worth of the principles that define them. But trial of chance or trial of worth, all games aspire to the condition of war, for here that which is wagered swallows up game, player, and all. Suppose two men at cards with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard such a tale, a turn of the card? The whole universe for such a player has labored clanking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at that man's hand or at that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enhancement of the game to its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is a preference absolute and irrevocable, and it is a dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance either one. In such games as have for their sake the annihilation of the defeated, the decisions are quite clear. This man holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hand is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. Brown studied the judge. You're crazy, Holden. Crazy at last. The judge smiled. Might does not make right, said Irving. The man that wins in some combat is not vindicated morally. Moral law, here's a long paragraph, but you see why this is relevant, right? I mean, this was an interesting chapter, like little embodiment of the message of the book for me. If that's what this book entirely is, I could think of nothing more on point for this show because we, in the last few years and ever since the inception of shows that I've been doing on the internets, have been anti-war, right? And yet we grapple with the inevitability of war and this idea that war is inherent in the human experience. It's inherent to the human condition. I think this is a little different of a take on it, but war is God, right? That could sum up the entire 3 pages of like self-indulgent text that the judge has here. Basically, the idea that everything else would be boring, and war, like the risk of war, is what gives things meaning, and that's all it is and all it ever will be, because it's the truest measure of like meaning that can be bestowed upon anything. That war is divine, war is ever present, war is, like, he equates it to like this religious experience, that this twist of fate, the cards that you're given determines who goes on and who doesn't, and that experience giving meaning to everything. It seems to mirror like the whole question of religion and Christianity, of like why does God allow, because atheists will have like this gotcha, where like, or people who struggle with their belief, people who have been through really terrible things would say, well, if God exists, why would he let this happen to me? And I think the real answer is that, well, it's without the evil in the world, there could be no good, because everything would just be blah. You have to have those polarities in order to, like that duality, in order to have any kind of meaning for anything to happen ever. Otherwise, if we just get to, drink strawberry shakes all day, every day, bad things will happen, but you'll get sick of strawberry shakes, or strawberry shakes aren't special anymore, or treats aren't special anymore. If you can just have them all the time, there's nothing special about it. So moving on, he tackles some of the counter argument, right? That there is like a objective wrong, that there's objective morality, basically. He says moral law is an invention of mankind for the disenfranchisement of the powerful in favor of the weak. Historical law subverts it at every turn. A moral view can never be proven right or wrong by any ultimate test. A man falling dead in a duel is not thought thereby to be proven in error as to his views. His very involvement in such a trial gives evidence of a new and broader view. The willingness of the principles to forego further argument as the triviality which it in fact is, and to petition directly the chambers of the historical absolute, clearly indicates of how little moment are the opinions, and of what great moment the divergences thereof. For the argument is indeed trivial, but not to the separate wills thereby made manifest. Man's vanity may well approach the infinite in capacity, but his knowledge remains imperfect, and however much he comes to value his judgments, ultimately he must submit them before a higher court. Here there can be no special pleading. Here are considerations of equity and rectitude and moral right rendered void and without warrant, and here are the views of the litigants despised. Decisions of life and death, of what shall be and what shall not, beggar all question of right. And elections of these magnitudes are all lesser ones, subsumed moral, spiritual, and natural. The judge searched out the circle for disputants. But what says the priest, he said. Tobin looked up. The priest does not say. So the priest doesn't participate. The priest does not say, said the judge. Nile dixit. Is it dixit? Nile dixit. But the priest has said, for the priest has put by the robes of his craft and taken up the tools of that higher calling which all men honor. The priest also would be no God server, but a God himself. Basically, the priest has put down his robe and joined the murderous gang. So he spoke with his actions what God he believes in, and that God is himself, which is really kind of Satanist, right? I mean, the real deal Satanism is the ego-driven self, right? That basically that you are your own God. It's kind of like an ultimate blasphemy because worshiping the ego-driven self instead of some higher God. Tobin shook his head. You've a blasphemous tongue, Holden, Judge Holden. And in truth, I was never a priest, but only a novitiate to the order. Journeyman priest or apprentice priest, said the judge. Men of God and men of war have strange affinities. I'd not second say you in your notions, said Tobin. Don't ask it. Ah, priest, said the judge, what could I ask of you that you've not already given? So it's also kind of interesting because the judge is, so out of place in time that he talks much more in a much more sophisticated manner than anyone else. He's so out of place. And I just think his speeches are long-winded, not as much as like Ayn Rand or something like that. But Cormac McCarthy, I think, once said that there's nothing else to write about except for like death, like life and death, that nothing else is basically worthy of his consideration or time. And I think that's pretty clear in this book. This is kind of like the penultimate example of that. And I do think it is a masterpiece. I do think that it is maybe one of like the greatest American novels of all time, although it's unadaptable to film and it's not easy to read. It's not a page turner, really, although it is at times. It can be. I did really enjoy it, but I don't think I'll revisit it anytime soon. I think it's got great things to consider and great passages, and this character of the judge really is haunting. And probably Wendigoon says that he's the greatest villain in all of fiction ever, that he's just stands head and shoulders above everything. And I don't know if I necessarily agree, but I will say that the more you think about him, the more terrifying that he becomes. Like, it's not a text in which you're reading him and you get creeped out like you do in like Pet Sematary or something like that. But it's later on when he's formed kind of like a specter in your mind, or like a splinter in your mind, and you're trying to work it out in the middle of the night, where you really start to get spooked out by him because he is immortal. He's like a vampire in a sense, that there's these little tidbits that tell you that he's seen things, centuries old things, that he's traveled the world, that he's a polyglot because he speaks Spanish and Latin and English and probably other languages. I think maybe German at some point. And he doesn't age at all. He's calculating, he's cold, he's ruthless, he's unpredictable, which is maybe the most scary part. And you run into him. And it might take 30 years, but you run into him. And the place he chooses to be at that point in time is the American West. Really interesting. There was one story as well where like how he came to be with the Glanton gang, where they just were in a dire strait. There was like 8 of them being pursued by a huge gang of natives who were after them. And they run up this mountain and they run into Judge Holden on the mountain, just sitting there wandering, sketching things, I think. And they can't fight back against the Indians because they ran out of gunpowder. And they come up to him randomly on the mountain and they're begging I don't know if they're begging for his help, or I can't remember exactly what it is, but he ends up basically creating gunpowder from things that he found on the mountain. And at one point, I think it's like a bunch of sulfur or something like that. And he instructs everyone to pee on the sulfur, and he's mixing it up in this big with his hands, and everyone pees on it as the Indians are coming up the mountain at them. And he makes gunpowder, and they use it all to fight against the Indians, and they just slaughter them. So it's kind of how the judge comes to be with the Glanton gang. So I think in a sense, it's true, though. How much are we, for those of us who are principally anti-war people, what is success and what is an end game that we should have as like I don't know, a guiding point? So we've talked about non-interventionism. We've talked about what it means to be an American realist, or excuse me, a libertarian realist, as Justin Raimondo would point out. He talked about in his pieces. And we've talked about all that, but we've talked about killing in war and morality, and I've made the case for basically that this inherent resistance to killing is part of our nature from like a biological evolutionary sense. That's not without exception either. But how do we grapple with what McCarthy is saying, that essentially you can't have objective morality that might basically does equal right, that all meaning ever comes from this game of war, that war is everything, that there is no, I mean, when you come down to what individual organisms and species are, is this fight to survive and procreate and pass on your genes. So therefore, what can have any greater meaning in the world than protecting that endeavor? And maybe aside from war and killing and survival and competing, more importantly, there's sex as being, when you think about that evolutionary biological process, basically being everything. For those of you without kids out there, first of all, you suck. Second of all, it's harder to realize this, I guess, unless you've been through the process of having children, realizing that, well, when everything's all said and done, there is no other meaning to your life other than growing up, falling, maybe not even falling in love, but having kids and raising those children. That's what you're put here to do. That's the whole point of, for some reason, we are just, born into this world in a long chain of going back eons of people coming one after another. And we just, by a strange roll of the dice, got this biology, got these genes, this DNA structure being present in this, meat sack, just going through time. But ultimately, the game being to find another meat sack and, create offspring to further the genes that are within you. And where you come into conflict with others, being able to protect yourself. And that might mean killing others so that you can, in turn, live on and prosper and spread your genes further. I mean, if really that's all it is, then I guess the judge really is right when he says that war is everything. And that's what it all boils down to. And then how does that apply to, that completely undercuts maybe any argument to the contrary. I don't think that's necessarily has to, but it seems to, at least in the book. Holden is the most articulate one by far, in kind of like a really irritating way. You listen to a couple pages of his prose. But again, that, of course, we're never going to be able to get rid of war. I think it's a naive joke to say that we could. There's nothing wrong, I think, with endeavoring to have less of it, because we don't live in a world anymore where it is dog eat dog in the way that maybe it was at one point in time. And yeah, I think there's a lot of arguments against libertarianism presented in this. I think a lot of arguments against, for more of a Hobbesian view of the world and the idea of this conflict, and maybe in a Machiavellian sense. I would probably say that Judge Holden is a Machiavellian, believing that you need to do whatever it is that you can to survive and put yourself in power and manipulate other people to in the process, and that there is no who cares if it's right or not, that everyone basically is a hypocrite for participating in this world and then saying that there is no that there is some kind of morality, to be participating in the war, but then say that there is a morality that exists outside of it, when they show by their actions that, well, they are a participant in war. And maybe it'd be easier for, the judge to argue against somebody else, for that other person, because everyone he's sitting down with at the campfire and arguing this to, they're all cutthroat murderers. So they can't really say, well, there is an objective morality, maybe. So yeah, read Blood Meridian. I'll put probably a, I don't know, Amazon affiliate link or something in the show notes page for you to go buy it someplace. I definitely would read it. Sorry to spoil it here. I thought I probably gave fair warning, but there's a lot of enjoyment you can get out of it still. If you go over to the Libertarian Institute, remember that the Vital Dissent is featured as a podcast on the Libertarian Institute right here. And we're having a fundraiser right now. You can head on over and get some of our books. We have matching funds right now. At the point of recording, we only have 1/6 of our goal, our $60,000 goal for this fundraising cycle. If you will, please, we have matching funds. Go over, check that out. But if you go over to donate, you can see that we have perks and kickbacks here for you guys. It's a tax deductible donation you can send over and help us keep the lights on. Really appreciate it. Next week, I say next week, I don't know if it'll be next week, but I think next time I'm going to talk about The Giver, which is a dystopian book for kids that I really enjoyed. Some really good things about it, some things I want to kind of pick apart a little bit about it, but it is one of my favorite dystopian books. I think that we'll enjoy it. If you guys haven't read it, it's a really interesting read. So thank you, libertarianinstitute.org. We'll catch you next time. Peace.